The dusty RCA-44 ribbon microphone had been sitting in the corner of the music equipment store for almost 2 years. Nobody wanted it. It was old technology, outdated, the kind of mic that professional studios had replaced with newer, better, more expensive models. The price tag said $50. It might as well have said worthless, because in 1955, $50 for a microphone meant it was junk. The good microphones, the professional ones, cost thousands. $5,000 for a Neumann U47, $3,000 for an AKG C12. Real recording equipment cost real money. The RCA-44 just sat there, gathering dust, taking up space. The store manager had tried to throw it away twice, but something always stopped him. Maybe someone would buy it eventually, use it for something, anything. On this particular afternoon in October 1955, a man walked into the store wearing casual clothes, a wrinkled shirt, no tie. He looked like he'd just come from playing golf or working in his garden, not like someone who was about to test a $5,000 microphone. The clerk, Brad, was 24 years old, newly hired, eager to prove he knew about audio equipment, to show he understood the difference between professional gear and consumer junk. Brad saw the man looking at the expensive Neumann U47 in the display case, saw him studying it, reading the specifications, and Brad made an assumption, a judgment, the kind of judgment that was about to teach him a very expensive lesson. "That's a $5,000 microphone, sir," Brad said. His tone was polite, but underneath it was a clear message: you can't afford this. The man smiled. "I'd like to test it." Brad hesitated. "Maybe I should show you something more in your price range first." The man looked at Brad, then at the dusty RCA-44 in the corner. "What about that one?" And everything was about to change. This is the story of how a $50 microphone became worth more than a $5,000 one. How Dean Martin taught a know-it-all clerk that equipment doesn't make the artist, and how talent can turn junk into gold. The music equipment store was called Hollywood Audio, located on Sunset Boulevard, right in the heart of the recording district. It had opened in 1948, right after the war, when recording industry was booming. Soldiers were coming home, the economy was growing, people had money to spend on entertainment. Records, radio, television was just starting. Every week, new recording studios were opening. Capitol Records had just built their iconic Tower building. RCA had expanded their studios. Independent labels were springing up everywhere. Radio stations were going on air in cities across America. Everyone needed microphones, good ones, professional equipment that could capture quality sound. The owner, Mr. Henderson, had built a reputation for carrying the best equipment. He'd traveled to Germany personally to establish relationships with Neumann, to Austria to work with AKG. He understood that post-war recording technology was advancing rapidly, that the studios wanted the newest, the best, the most advanced equipment available. Mr. Henderson had also built relationships with artists. Frank Sinatra shopped there. Bing Crosby sent his engineers there. When Capitol Records needed equipment, they called Hollywood Audio first. The store was more than a retailer. It was a hub, a place where engineers, producers, and artists came to learn about new technology, to test equipment, to share knowledge. Brad had started working there 3 weeks earlier, fresh out of technical school. He was young, enthusiastic, had read every manual, memorized every spec sheet. He could tell you the frequency response of any microphone in the store, the impedance, the polar pattern, the signal-to-noise ratio. He knew his stuff, or thought he did. What Brad didn't know was the difference between technical knowledge and practical wisdom, between reading about music and understanding it, between knowing what equipment cost and knowing what it was worth, between specs on paper and sound in reality. The RCA-44 had been a good microphone once. In the 1930s and 40s, it was the standard for radio broadcasting. Smooth frequency response, natural sound. Every major radio station had several, but by 1955, ribbon microphones had fallen out of favor. Newer condenser mics were more sensitive, more reliable. Ribbon mics were considered obsolete. This particular RCA-44 had come in as a trade-in 2 years ago, someone upgrading to a Neumann. The store had accepted it, thinking they'd sell it quickly to a hobbyist or a small radio station, but nobody wanted it. It just sat there, gathering dust, taking up valuable display space. Dean Martin had walked into Hollywood Audio looking for a microphone to test for his upcoming album sessions at Capitol Records. He wasn't necessarily looking to buy, just wanted to see what was available, to test some options, to hear how different mics captured his voice. Dean had been recording professionally for almost 10 years. He knew microphones, knew which ones worked for his voice and which ones didn't. He didn't care about price tags or brand names. He cared about sound. When Brad approached with his polite but condescending offer to show Dean something in his price range, Dean recognized the tone immediately. He'd heard it before. People judging him by his appearance, assuming he couldn't afford things, making decisions for him based on his clothes. Dean could have told Brad who he was, could have mentioned the 30 albums he'd recorded, the #1 hits, the sold-out shows, but that would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, Dean pointed to the dusty RCA 44 in the corner, the forgotten microphone, the one nobody wanted. "What about that one?" Dean asked. Brad looked at the RCA 44, tried not to laugh. "That one? Sir, that's outdated technology. It's a ribbon microphone. Nobody uses those anymore. They've been completely replaced by condenser mics. Better frequency response, more reliable. That thing is basically a museum piece." "But it works?" Dean asked. "Well, yes, technically it works, but it's not going to give you professional quality. If you're serious about recording, you need a Neumann or an AKG. Those are the industry standard now." "Can I try the museum piece?" Dean asked. "Sure, but you're wasting your time. Once you hear how it sounds compared to a real professional mic, you'll understand why nobody uses them anymore." Brad set up both microphones, the Neumann U47 on one stand, the RCA 44 on another, connected them both to the store's playback system so they could compare the sound quality. Try the Neumann first so you can hear what a real professional microphone sounds like. Dean stood in front of the Neumann U47. $5,000 worth of German engineering, the best microphone money could buy in 1955, the microphone that Frank Sinatra used, that every major recording studio had. Dean sang one verse of That's Amore. Clean, professional. The Neumann captured every nuance, every breath. It sounded expensive. Perfect, exactly what you'd expect from a $5,000 microphone. Brad nodded approvingly. "See? That's professional quality. That's what you pay for. Now try the old ribbon mic and you'll hear the difference." Dean moved to the RCA 44, the dusty $50 microphone that nobody wanted, the obsolete technology, the museum piece, the microphone that had been sitting in the corner for 2 years waiting for someone to give it a chance. Dean adjusted the stand slightly, positioned himself at exactly the right distance, not too close, not too far, the way ribbon mics needed to be used, the way modern engineers had forgotten because condenser mics were more forgiving. Then Dean sang the same verse of That's Amore, and something magical happened. The RCA 44 captured Dean's voice differently than the Neumann, not worse, different, warmer, more intimate, less clinical, less perfect, more human. The Neumann had captured every technical detail, every breath, every slight variation in pitch. It was accurate, precise, professional, but it was also cold, sterile, like listening to a perfect machine. The RCA 44 captured something else. It picked up the richness in Dean's voice, the character, the warmth, the soul. It smoothed out the harsh edges without losing clarity. It made Dean sound the way he sounded in person, not the way he looked on a spec sheet. The difference was subtle but profound. The Neumann sounded like Dean Martin in a recording studio. The RCA 44 sounded like Dean Martin in your living room, singing just for you, personal, intimate, real. The sound filled the store. Other customers stopped what they were doing, turned to listen. A woman shopping for guitar strings put down the package she was holding. A man testing amplifiers turned down his volume. 3 people who'd been looking at sheet music walked over.
Because this wasn't just good, This was special. This was why people fell in love with music, not because of technical perfection, but because of emotional connection. And the cheap, dusty, supposedly obsolete microphone was creating that connection in a way the expensive one couldn't. Brad stood there, confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. The expensive microphone was supposed to sound better. That's how it worked. You paid more, you got better quality. That was the rule. But Dean's voice through the cheap RCA 44 sounded better than it had through the expensive Neumann. Not technically better, but emotionally better. More real, more Dean. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, emerged from his office in the back. He'd heard the singing, recognized the voice, walked out to see what was happening. He saw Dean Martin standing in front of the old RCA 44, saw Brad looking confused and slightly panicked, saw the other customers gathering around. Mr. Henderson walked over to Brad, kept his voice low. "Brad, do you know who that is?" Brad shook his head. "That's Dean Martin. He's recorded 30 albums. He's sold millions of records. He knows more about microphones than you'll learn in your entire career." Brad's face went red. I didn't know. He didn't say anything." "He didn't have to say anything. You should have treated him with respect regardless of who he was or what he was wearing." Dean finished the verse, stepped back from the microphone, looked at Brad with a slight smile. "The expensive microphone is technically superior," Dean said, his voice calm and educational rather than condescending. "Better frequency response on paper, lower noise floor in the measurements, flatter curve across the spectrum. All those things you read about in the spec sheets, all those numbers that look impressive in catalogs. The Neumann U47 is an exceptional piece of engineering. I'm not saying it isn't." Brad nodded, relieved that Dean wasn't angry, wasn't humiliating him. "But here's what the spec sheets don't tell you," Dean continued. "The cheap microphone captured something the expensive one didn't. It captured the feeling, the emotion, the human part of the performance, the warmth, the intimacy, the character. Those things don't show up in frequency response charts. You can't measure them with test equipment, but they're what make music connect with people." Dean walked over to the RCA 44, put his hand on it gently, like it was something valuable, something worth respecting. "Here's what you need to understand," Dean said, looking at Brad directly but kindly. "The microphone doesn't make the singer makes the microphone. You can have the most expensive equipment in the world, but if you don't have talent, if you don't have something to say, if you don't have emotion to convey, it won't matter. The equipment won't save you. It'll just capture your lack of talent in higher fidelity." The other customers in the store were listening now. This had become a masterclass, free education from one of the best voices in the business. And if you do have talent, if you do have something real to communicate, you can make a $50 microphone sound like it cost $5,000, because the value isn't in the equipment. The value is what you bring to it. The equipment is just a tool. The artist is what matters.
Brad stood there, absorbing this. Everything he'd learned in technical school, everything he'd read in manuals, was being recontextualized, expanded, given depth that numbers on a page couldn't provide. "I'm not saying technical quality doesn't matter," Dean clarified. "It does. If you're recording for commercial release, you need good equipment. But good doesn't always mean most expensive. Good means right for the purpose, right for the voice, right for the song. This RCA 44, for my voice, for certain songs, it's better than the Neumann, not because it's technically superior, but because it captures what I'm trying to express." Dean turned to Mr. Henderson. "I'll take the RCA 44. Mr. Henderson looked surprised. "Mr. Martin, we can give you the Neumann, at cost. It would be an honor." Dean shook his head. "I don't need the Neumann. This RCA 44 captures my voice the way I want it captured. That's worth more than any spec sheet." Dean paid $50 for the microphone, carried it out of the store himself, used it on his next 3 albums. That dusty, forgotten, supposedly obsolete microphone became one of his favorites. He'd request it specifically when recording certain songs that needed that warm, intimate sound. Brad learned several lessons that day. First, never judge a customer by their appearance. Second, technical specifications don't tell the whole story. Third, equipment is only as good as the person using it. And fourth, humility is more valuable than technical knowledge. The story spread through the music equipment industry. About the time Dean Martin chose a $50 ribbon mic over a $5,000 condenser mic, about how he proved that talent matters more than technology, that the artist makes the equipment, not the other way around. The RCA 44 ribbon microphone. $50. Obsolete technology. Nobody wanted it. Until Dean Martin made it priceless.